Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. Now, Red Dragon is a crime drama / psychological horror novel published in 1981, and this was Thomas Harris's second novel, his first being his 1975 book Black Sunday, which I believe was about terrorists trying to bomb the Super Bowl. That was completely unconnected to this, but this is actually the first of what is now known as the Hannibal Lecter series. Even though at the time Harris wrote this as a purely standalone novel and had no real intention of ever doing sequels. In fact, Hannibal Lecter himself is a relatively minor character in this first book, and Thomas Harris has even admitted that he never really intended on bringing this character back in his later books. Like, for as iconic as Lecter would eventually become, he was kind of an afterthought. Now, this is actually the third review on this book that I've done on this channel. I first reviewed this book all the way back in 2011. I think it was like one of my first book reviews, and that review sucked like most of my reviews back then did, but I redid it in early 2015, which I can't fucking believe was 10 years ago now, and my 2015 review of this book is still up. However, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2015 review of Red Dragon. Now, before becoming a novelist, Thomas Harris worked as a journalist for the Waco Tribune Herald, covering the police beat and covering actual crime scenes. Now, for research, he attended classes and spoke with FBI agents at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. And some of this book, particularly the main character, is loosely based on real-life FBI agent John E. Douglas, who was one of the first criminal profilers for the FBI. John Douglas basically wrote the book on serial killer profiling, and if you're familiar with the series Mindhunter on Netflix, that series is literally based on John Douglas and interviews he's conducted with well-known serial killers. So the plot of Red Dragon is we follow a former FBI criminal profiler with a heightened sense of empathy named Will Graham, who previously helped track down two serial killers. One was a man named Garrett Jacob Hobbs, who was murdering young women, and Graham was actually forced to kill this guy in order to save one of Hobbs's would-be victims. But after killing Hobbs, Graham had a mental breakdown and spent some time in a psychiatric hospital, but shortly afterwards he tracked down another serial killer, this one both killing and cannibalizing his victims. This killer turned out to be a psychiatrist named Dr. Hannibal Lecter, and when Lecter realized that he was caught, he tried to kill Graham. So Will Graham's experience with Dr. Lecter, coupled with the guilt over having to kill Garrett Jacob Hobbs, has left Graham deeply traumatized, and he leaves the FBI and now just wants to live a quiet life with his wife and stepson. But one day, Graham's friend and former superior at the FBI, Jack Crawford, shows up to his house showing him pictures of two families that were recently murdered by a serial killer who the FBI is nicknaming the Tooth Fairy. And it appears that this killer is working on a lunar cycle, so they have till the next full moon before he strikes again. And Crawford knows that they have a better shot at catching this guy quickly if Graham helps them with these investigations. So Graham reluctantly comes out of retirement because he knows he would not be able to live with himself if the Tooth Fairy murdered another family. But in order to recover the mindset of a killer, Graham goes to visit Hannibal Lecter, who is now locked away in a psychiatric hospital. But this is going to cost him dearly, because Will Graham has a rare talent for getting his mind in sync with the criminals that he tracks down, and thinking like they do, but this takes a severe psychological toll on him, and Hannibal knows this and plays into it. And eventually we do find find out who this killer is, and I don't consider this a spoiler because it's revealed relatively early on in the story, but the Tooth Fairy is actually this deeply disturbed man named Francis Dollarhide, a man who believes himself to be possessed by the spirit of an evil dragon, and he believes that with every family he annihilates, this brings him one step closer to transcending and becoming something more than human. And these two men, Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide, are heading towards an inevitable collision course. So yeah, Red Dragon, it is a very good psychological thriller, and the whole conceit of the novel is, if you are going to enter the mind of a killer, make sure you can get out first. And that's essentially Will Graham's character. Now, the whole concept of a detective or FBI agent getting inside the mind of a killer and thinking like the killer does, it's a concept that's been played around with a lot in detective fiction, and it is a little cliched and a little tropey, but to be fair, at the time this novel was published, I don't think it was as cliched as it probably is now, and we have to realize that a lot of the stuff that follows that trope kind of is borrowing from Red Dragon. This book actually inspired a lot. And even though it is a trope that you see a lot in these kinds of stories, it can be done well, and it is done well in this book. And the character work, I do think, is probably the best thing about the book, and Will Graham really is a fascinating character. Like, he builds these thoughts in his head so he can think like the killer does and understand why the killer did what they did, and he puts himself in the shoes of these killers, but again, it really does screw with him psychologically, and he doesn't like this. Like, he doesn't like having this almost pure form of empathy. Because Will Graham, he really does start to empathize with this serial killer, and he doesn't like that. He even starts to think, am I just as sick as him? And Hannibal Lecter, who again is a minor character in this book, he knows this, and he's sort of poking and prodding at Will's psyche, and in his own way, he's sort of trying to push Will over the edge. Like, in some ways, Hannibal Lecter is almost like the devil on Will's shoulder. And Graham is already dealing with some severe psychological trauma because of what happened in the past, and working on this case is really not good for his mental health at all. And the thing that's fucked up about Jack Crawford is Crawford knows this, but he also knows that Will is their best shot at catching this killer fast. Like, Crawford is determined to stop these murders and save lives, even if it is at the expense of a friend. And to talk about the main villain, Francis Dollarhide, he is also a fascinating character, and there's a large portion of this novel where we are following his point of view, and we're in his shoes to a point where we almost sympathize with him is not the right word, because he's committed horrific, unforgivable crimes, but at the same time, though, we understand what led him to this point. It doesn't excuse what he's done, but we sort of understand how he became the way he did. Like, we get several flashbacks in the book to Dollarhide's childhood, and we realize that he was the victim of severe, severe abuse from his psychotic grandmother. Like, there's a part in the book, like, it's a flashback to when he was a child. He wet the bed, and his grandmother literally grabbed a pair of scissors and threatened to castrate the poor kid if he wet the bed again. And then when he was taken out of the care of his grandmother, that didn't make things much better, because he was eventually placed in the care of his actual mother, but was severely bullied by his step-siblings because he had, like, a cleft lip. As an adult, he got surgery to fix his cleft palate, but he still thinks he's deformed. And all these years of abuse has caused him to hate himself so much that he now needs to become something else. And these murders are almost like rituals that are all part of his great becoming, his metamorphosis into this great red dragon, which of course he gets from the William Blake painting. And the great red dragon does kind of become sort of an alternate personality for him. It really is a fascinating character study on a psychopath. Now, in the novel, Dollarhide does develop a romantic relationship with a blind coworker of his named Reba. Obviously, none of his coworkers realize that he's a serial killer. And even though it's really awkward, you still sort of buy this relationship, and you're also kind of rooting for it because you realize that Reba might be the one thing that could potentially redeem Dollarhide. Reba is the one person who actually gives Dollarhide what he's desired his entire life, and that's for somebody to actually love him. But unfortunately, Dollarhide's delusions do not allow him this happiness. So he is a tragic character, but the book never makes excuses for the things he does either. And you're still rooting for Will Graham to take this guy out. I also feel the book could sort of be read as an exploration of trauma, and how trauma can shape people in very different ways. Obviously, Dollarhide's traumas shaped him into this irredeemable monster, whereas Graham's trauma, I don't want to say shaped him in a positive way, because that's kind of a horrible thing to say, but at the same time, his trauma does arguably lead him to doing some good because he doesn't want other people to experience the same kind of traumas that he experienced. And as much as Graham and Dollarhide do sort of mirror each other throughout the story, the big difference between them really is empathy. In the book, we also get some interesting sort of commentary and even some subtle satire on the media, particularly tabloid media, and how it sort of sensationalizes serial killers. We especially get that with the Freddie Lowndes character. Freddie Lowndes is this sleazy asshole journalist who works for this tabloid newspaper called The Tattler. And my god, he is such a fucking prick. He did something really fucked up to Graham in the past, and he's just a complete sleazebag. At the same time, what ends up happening to him in the book, yeah, as much as he was a douche, he definitely didn't deserve that, without giving too much away. But again, throughout the book, there are these little hints of how the media is sort of sensationalizing this. Like, there's one point where it mentions how on the news there's a countdown to the next full moon, because again, the Tooth Fairy works on sort of a lunar cycle. There's also some talk of how people across the country are getting panicked because of how the media is covering these murders. And even though this is meant to be a very serious crime drama, there is some subtle satire in the story, and the book actually does have a sense of humor, which doesn't always work 100% of the time. For example, there's a scene in the book where this lawyer for one of the murdered families calls Graham up, but Graham thinks it's his wife calling him, and he tries to talk all sexy to her, so he starts talking to what at first he thinks is his wife, and he calls her Hot Lips, and then the lawyer's like, who's Hot Lips? And it's like, okay, that was mildly funny, but then later on in the book, like when Graham is actually starting to put the pieces together and figure out how the Tooth Fairy was choosing his victims, he calls this lawyer up, and at the end of their conversation, he says, no, I won't introduce you to Hot Lips, and it's like, okay, again, it was a funny little nod to the scene from earlier, but it kind of ruined the whole tone of that scene, because again, it's a very important scene in the book later on where he's actually coming one step closer to figuring out who the Tooth Fairy is, and again, it just, tonally, the humor didn't really fit. There were also moments in the book that I thought were a little hokey. For example, there are scenes in the book where the Red Dragon is like talking to Dollarhide as if it really is a separate entity, almost like a spirit or a demon that is trying to possess Dollarhide, and I get it. He's schizophrenic, so he really does believe that this dragon is trying to possess him, but at the same time, some of those scenes felt like they would have fit more at home in an outright supernatural story, and again, this is meant to be more reality-based. Also, as the story goes on, Dollarhide is actually trying to stop and overcome his dragon persona. And there's a scene towards the end of the story where Dollarhide goes to the Brooklyn Museum where the original William Blake painting is being held, and he figures that a way he could possibly take control of his dragon persona is by actually destroying the original painting. So he goes to the museum giving them a fake name, pretending to be an art student, and the lady takes him into a back room where he can actually see the original painting, and he knocks her out and then crumples the painting up and eats it. And I get what the scene was supposed to mean symbolically, but I thought it was a little over the top and kinda silly. The book also has sort of a surprise twist ending that I didn't think worked 100%. So it's not a perfect book, but if you are a fan of crime dramas or detective fiction or serial killer fiction or psychological horror, it is a solid read. So Thomas Harris wrote 2 sequels to this. You had The Silence of the Lambs in 1988, which in many ways became even more famous than the first book. In fact, when most people think Hannibal Lecter, they tend to think of Silence of the Lambs. I actually think there are a lot of people who don't even realize that that book is a sequel. Now, Will Graham does not show up in that book, however, he is mentioned. The book actually focuses on an FBI trainee named Clarice Starling, who is trying to track down a serial killer nicknamed Buffalo Bill. But Lecter has a much bigger part to play in that book. And then Thomas Harris followed that up with Hannibal in 1999, which officially made Hannibal Lecter the titular character. And then Thomas Harris released a prequel novel in 2006 called Hannibal Rising, which expanded upon the backstory of Hannibal Lecter, which was touched upon in the third novel. Now, both Hannibal and Hannibal Rising would turn Hannibal Lecter into more of a tragic anti-hero, which I know is not a direction that fans were particularly pleased with. Now, each book in the series has been adapted to film, but in the case of Red Dragon, this has actually been adapted technically 3 times. It's been adapted twice to film, and then a third time on television. But before I talk about the adaptations of this book, as well as the other Thomas Harris adaptations, I want to cut to my friend Mark Allan Gunnells, who is a frequent guest in my videos, who is also an author himself, and he's a huge Thomas Harris fan, and here is him giving his thoughts on Thomas Harris's Red Dragon.
Hello out there, Mark Allan Gunnells here. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review on the Thomas Harris novel Red Dragon, which is a novel that I really love, so I'm happy to do so. Red Dragon was originally released in 1981, and it's actually Thomas Harris's second novel, but the first novel he wrote in the Hannibal Lecter saga. I did not read this one first. The first book I read in the series was Silence of the Lambs. The blockbuster movie had just come out, so I ran out to read that one, not even realizing that it was a sequel of sorts, and part of a series. But after I read that one and found out that Red Dragon existed, I ran out to get this book and was excited to read it, but also a little trepidatious. I had loved Silence of the Lambs so much that I kind of worried that this one might pale in comparison. But I was wrong. This is an excellent novel, very suspenseful, very tense. The pace is just, it's not fast-paced in the sense that you don't have time for the story to breathe and to get to know the characters, but it just keeps going along and keeping you hooked on the edge of your seat. In some ways, the Hannibal Lecter of this book is even more twisted than in Silence of the Lambs. I only say that because in Silence of the Lambs, he seemed to have some actual respect for Clarice Starling, but in this one, he does not really seem to have a great deal of respect for Will Graham, the FBI agent that is the lead character here, which makes him even more sadistic in some ways. Even though the basic plot is very similar to Silence of the Lambs, FBI agent using Hannibal Lecter to try to catch a current serial killer, the books are very different. The relationship Hannibal Lecter has with Will Graham in this one is much different than his relationship with Clarice Starling. Will Graham is the FBI agent who actually captured Hannibal Lecter, so their relationship is much more contentious and much more, I don't know, tense. It's really great reading there. And even though Hannibal Lecter remains incarcerated in this book, he does some serious damage. I'm not going to give away the ending, but it is a great suspenseful ending. And you know, the serial killer in this book is very interesting, very different from Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs. This serial killer almost has sort of a love story, which sounds ridiculous, but it works really well to make a really full, well-rounded character. I really recommend Red Dragon. I think it is a top-notch novel.
So Red Dragon was eventually adapted into the 1986 film Manhunter, written and directed by Michael Mann, the same Michael Mann who also co-created Miami Vice, and he also directed films like The Keep and Thief, and he would go on to direct movies like Last of the Mohicans, Heat, The Insider, Collateral, the movie adaptation of Miami Vice, and Ferrari, among many others. And I'm not even joking, Manhunter is seriously one of my top 10 favorite films of all time, even though I'll admit my top 10 list is somewhat changeable, but Manhunter has kind of always remained a consistent on that list, and I almost can't even pinpoint why. It's a movie I first saw when I was probably too young to appreciate it. I first saw it when I was like 10 or 11. My dad actually had it on VHS, and I think I liked it, but again, I think I was a little too young for it. I ended up rediscovering the movie in middle school, and it became a movie I would just watch all the time. It just became a very important and very impactful movie to me. Now, it does change quite a bit from the book, but I'm not gonna lie, and I know some people are going to highly disagree with me on this. I actually think the changes that Michael Mann made actually improve the story a little bit. Now, when I compare movies to books, I hate saying one is better than the other because, at the end of the day, movies and books are two completely different ways of telling a story. They're two completely different forms of media. You can get away with stuff in a book that you can't necessarily get away with in a movie, and vice versa. That's why I do honestly get a little annoyed at people who say that the book is always better, because like, I feel when people say that, you're basically saying that you don't actually understand either medium. But all that being said, and now I'm probably contradicting my last point, a book can tell a certain story better than its adaptation does, and again, vice versa. There are the rare adaptations that do tell the story slightly better than their source material. And Manhunter is one of those adaptations for me. I hold it in the same category as Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and I love Stephen King, but I'll be honest, Kubrick improved upon that story. I feel the same way about The Devil's Advocate based on the Andrew Niederman novel. I'll be honest, I do think the movie Devil's Advocate is better than the book. The same thing with Alan Parker's Angel Heart based on the William Hortzberg novel Fallen Angel. I actually do think Alan Parker improved upon that story with Angel Heart. And to name another Stephen King adaptation, I actually do think Frank Darabont improved upon the Stephen King novella Rita Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption when he made The Shawshank Redemption in 1994. So once again, I put Manhunter in the same category as those other book-to-film adaptations I just named, but in general, I don't like saying one's better than either or. But while Manhunter does change a lot from Red Dragon, I would argue that Michael Mann does stay true to the tone and spirit, and most importantly, the themes of the novel. But he also does make it his own, and I think the movie does fit in thematically with the rest of Michael Mann's body of work. The film stars William Peterson as Will Graham, who, personally, I think nailed his role. Like, even when I was reading the book, I was visualizing William Peterson, and like, when he's going over the evidence, he's talking to himself, pretending as if he's talking to the killer, or even pretending that he is the killer in some instances. Like, you could tell his mind is going to some very dark places he doesn't want it to go, but he kind of needs it to go there so he can actually solve these crimes. Like, you have this moment towards the end of the film where Graham goes to the lead's house and is essentially playing the role of the Tooth Fairy, pretending that he is the Tooth Fairy killer, and then he's staring at the bed and essentially sees the ghost of Mrs. Leeds. Not literally, there's nothing actually supernatural in the movie, but he's sort of visualizing Mrs. Leeds on the bed with mirrors in her eyes and mouth, and it's such a creepy image, and I just love the way William Peterson delivers that line. I think the exact line is, "I see you there, and I see me desired by you, accepted and loved in the silver mirrors of your eyes." Like, it's so creepy, yet oddly kind of poetic. And you totally get the idea that Graham might actually be just as crazy as Dollarhide. You also have Dennis Farina as Jack Crawford, and I know this character has been played by multiple actors over the years, but to be honest, when I read the book, I visualize Dennis Farina. To me, Dennis Farina is Jack Crawford. Now, I believe Farina actually was a cop before he became an actor, and you can tell he's bringing some of that to the role. And there are actually these subtle nuances to his performance, like towards the end when Graham is watching home movies of the two families, and he finally starts to piece it together how the killer was able to choose these two families, and as Graham is piecing it together, you see Jack Crawford in the background kind of slowly get up from his chair and sort of back up against the wall, and you can tell he's both in awe at how easily Graham is able to put these pieces together, but you could also tell he's kind of terrified at how easily Graham is able to do this. And I actually do think William Peterson and Dennis Farina had really good chemistry together in the film. You also have Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. Now, he's only in 3 scenes in the movie, but to be honest, really in the book, he's only in, like, 3 scenes. Because we gotta remember, this was before Lecter would become this iconic character. In this movie, and in the book, he is a relatively minor character. And I'm gonna say it, and I'm probably committing sacrilege here, but Cox is honestly my favorite Hannibal Lecter, despite his lack of screen time. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Anthony Hopkins, but Hopkins is much more theatrical as this character, whereas I feel Cox plays Hannibal Lecter much more subtly and much more realistically. And as opposed to the madman that Anthony Hopkins played in Silence of the Lambs, Cox plays Lecter as more of a pompous douchebag, but in a way that also makes it more terrifying when you consider what this guy did. And in the film, Francis Dollarhide is played by Tom Noonan, who does an amazing job in the film. Tom Noonan is such a criminally underrated actor. And he's so creepy in the movie, yet there is something very sad and tragic about him as well, even though it doesn't excuse his actions. Now, the movie does cut out Dollarhide's backstory. We do get subtle hints of it, especially in one scene where Graham theorizes that Dollarhide was probably an abused child, but it doesn't go into it that much. And while it probably pissed off fans of the book at the time, I actually think it was a smart decision on Michael Mann's part, because even though in a way that is the point of the character, sometimes less is more in the horror genre. Sometimes the less we know about a villain, the scarier they are. But Tom Noonan's portrayal of Francis Dollarhide in the movie, I think, is one of the most chilling depictions of a serial killer ever committed to film. I hold it right up there with Michael Rooker's portrayal of Henry in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I actually met Tom Noonan several years ago. He was very nice, but I'll be honest, I think I asked him some dumb fucking questions. Questions about Manhunter that I'm sure he's heard a billion fucking times. You also have Stephen Lang as Freddie Lowndes, who, much like in the book, is just a complete creep. You also had Joan Allen as Reba, who I thought did a great job, honestly. And she had very interesting chemistry with Tom Noonan, where it is awkward and it's also really creepy when you realize what Frances Dolarhyde has done, but at the same time, there is something about it that's almost endearing in a fucked up way, and you totally buy it. You also had Kim Grest, I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, as Will's wife Molly, who I think did a very good job. I will say in the book, Will and Molly's relationship was a little more strained, especially when certain things happen, whereas we don't really get that in the movie, and I will say Molly technically did have a little more agency in the book than she does in the film. Regardless, I think Kim Grest did a great job. You also have a brief appearance from character actor Marshall Bell as a cop. It's like literally a blink and you'll miss it moment, but Marshall Bell you might recognize as Gordy LeChance's dad in Stand By Me and as Coach Snyder in Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I do wonder if there were originally more scenes with him in the movie, because while he's not a big name, he is a relatively well-known character actor, and it's kind of odd that in the movie he's literally only in one shot, and he's almost more of a glorified extra in the film. There's also a rather interesting cameo from Chris Elliott, who I think at the time was best known for his appearances on David Letterman, and I remember I was watching this movie with my friend Matt, and when that scene came up, Matt was like, "Holy shit! That's Chris Elliott!" And I also gotta mention, Dante Spinoni's cinematography in the film is freaking spellbinding. Like, even though it's a reality-based drama, it's shot almost like a Dario Argento film, but the way the film utilizes colors and lighting, it gives the film a distinctly dreamlike quality, even though, again, it is a relatively grounded crime drama. But it works very well with Graham's dream sequences and certain moments in the film where Dolarhyde is sort of hallucinating, and something that Dante Spinoni does really well is there's certain moments that are clearly from Dolarhyde's point of view, but what's done so brilliantly is you get some shots that are clearly from Will Graham's point of view, and they're almost the same, to show that both these characters' minds are almost in sync with each other. And something that Michael Mann and Dante Spinoni also do so brilliantly is they really do utilize cinematic language to sort of tell us what the characters thinking or feeling. For example, in the scene where Graham goes to visit Lecter in his cell, the way it's shot, like it's constantly jumping back and forth from Graham's point of view and from Lecter's point of view, and because they're both separated by bars, we're seeing both characters behind bars when it's jumping back and forth between these shots, showing that, in a way, they're both caged men. They're both men who are trapped in prisons of their own making. Lecter, of course, is trapped in a literal prison, whereas Graham is trapped in a prison of his mind. I also love the soundtrack of the film. It is very 80s, but that really doesn't bother me. But there are a lot of moments in the film where it's shot almost like an 80s music video, and I know that was a huge critique from critics at the time, who felt the film was more style over substance. But I disagree with that. It is a very stylized film, but I absolutely think there is substance to the film as well. Granted, some of that is substance that came from the book, and some of it is substance I think Michael Mann also added to the story as well. Also, the song In-The-Gadda-Da-Vida by Iron Butterfly is used to brilliant effect in one of the film's final sequences. Now, I am about to give away a spoiler for both the ending of the book and the ending of the film, because the movie does change the book's ending. So, the book ended with Dolarhyde apparently killing himself as his house was burning down. The issue is, the only person to quote-unquote witness his suicide was Reba, a blind woman. And basically, at the very end of the book, we realize that Dolarhyde faked his death, and the charge third body that they found in his house was actually the body of a gas station attendant that he had killed earlier. And so Dollarhide then goes after Graham and his family in the last, 2 or 3 chapters of the book. And I'll be honest, I was not crazy about that ending just because I thought it was a little far-fetched. Whereas the movie changes it to where Dollarhide is killed in a police shootout. Yes, it's a little more simplified, but it's done so fucking well in the movie, especially because that final, police shootout is all edited to the song In-The-Gadda-Da-Vida, and it's edited almost like an exploitation film where there are these weird jump cuts that might take you out of the movie, but the way I see it, in that final sequence, we are basically inside both Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide's minds at that point, and both their minds are in sync with each other, and neither man is really living in the same reality as any of the other characters in that scene. And basically the scene ends with Graham shooting Dollarhide dead. Now yes, it is a little more simplistic than the ending of the book, but at the same time, I do feel there's stuff to analyze with the final scene, because after Dollarhide falls to the floor and we see the blood spreading out, it almost appears to be wings. Dragon wings, implying that in death he truly has become the Great Red Dragon. There's also a very interesting moment where Graham points his gun at Dollarhide's corpse, and you can tell he's almost thinking to himself, "You are dead, right?" There's also a scene that's only in the director's cut where Graham goes to see the family that they determined would have been Dollarhide's next target. And I think that scene was so important because you could tell Graham needed to see this family that he just saved to remind himself why he went through what he did and why he did what he did, and I think to sort of remind himself that he's still human. But yeah, I love Manhunter. I cannot sing this movie's praises enough. It does differ from the book, but I would argue it stays true to the book in tone and spirit. It's one of my favorite psychological thrillers, it's one of my favorite crime drama films, it's one of my favorite 80s cop films, it's one of my favorite horror films. Like, whichever category you want to put it in, I think it's a criminally underrated classic. Unfortunately, it wasn't appreciated at the time. Like I said, critics at the time found it to be more style over substance, and financially, I don't think it did that well either, but the film has garnered a cult following over the years, especially on home video, and now people have really sort of reevaluated the film, and now there's a lot of critics who do consider it to be a bona fide classic. And the film has made a significant impact on popular culture. Like, I believe the creator of CSI has said that Manhunter was a direct influence on that show. And the fact that William Peterson played one of the main characters in the original incarnation of CSI was probably not a coincidence. You could even see the influence of this movie on shows like Cold Case, Criminal Minds, and even The X-Files. In fact, Tom Noonan actually did play a serial killer on an episode of The X-Files, and that's another case where I feel like that casting was probably not a coincidence. You also had Chris Carter's follow-up to The X-Files, Millennium, and the character of Frank Black on that show, played by the great Lance Hendrickson, is a very Will Graham-esque character. You could even see the influence of Manhunter and probably the films of Michael Mann in general on some of the films of Nicholas Winding Refn. Maybe not so much story-wise, but definitely stylistically. Like, a lot of the color scheme of movies like Drive and Neon Demon is also the color scheme of Manhunter. Manhunter was also spoofed on an episode of South Park. Now, before I talk about the other adaptations, here's my friend Mark Allan Gunnells again, giving his thoughts on Manhunter.
Now, it has been made into a movie twice. The first movie was called Manhunter, and it came out in 1986, directed by Michael Mann. It has a great reputation. It wasn't a big hit at the time, but has really developed a cult following. I will say I wasn't overly fond of it. It may be because I had already seen Silence of the Lambs and was comparing the two, but Manhunter has a very cold, clinical, distant feel to it that it kept me from getting fully invested into it, honestly. Probably the best thing about Manhunter for me is Brian Cox playing Hannibal Lecter. He gives a portrayal that is very different from that of Anthony Hopkins later. He does a great job making the character debonair but sinister.
After Manhunter, the second novel, The Silence of the Lambs, was adapted by Jonathan Demme in 1991. But because Manhunter did not do that well, when they made Silence of the Lambs, they made it as a purely self-contained movie, rather than a sequel to Manhunter, despite having several returning characters, like obviously Hannibal Lecter, this time played by Anthony Hopkins, and Jack Crawford, this time played by Scott Glenn, and Dr. Chilton, this time played by Anthony Heald. Dr. Chilton was in Manhunter, but he was played by a different actor. And the movie Silence of the Lambs omits all references to Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide, although oddly enough, I feel like Will Graham was sort of subtly alluded to in the part where Crawford warns Clarice that she doesn't want somebody like Hannibal Lecter in her head, which I felt was a subtle nod to Will Graham because that's exactly what happened with him. But besides that, there's no real connection between the movie version of Silence of the Lambs and Manhunter. And Silence of the Lambs is of course an amazing film. I do personally prefer Manhunter, but that's not taken away from Silence of the Lambs. It's still a classic movie and in some ways a groundbreaking film. And it was really the movie version of Silence of the Lambs, and probably more specifically Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of this character that made Hannibal Lecter a pop culture icon. The movie also had Jodie Foster as the film's protagonist, Clarice Starling, and Ted Levine as the villain, Jane Gum, or Buffalo Bill, who in some ways has become kind of a horror icon in his own right, if you want to consider Silence of the Lambs to be a full-fledged horror film. But obviously I'll talk more about the movie Silence of the Lambs when I get around to re-reviewing the book. Following Silence of the Lambs, Ridley Scott adapted the third novel, Hannibal, into the 2001 film of the same name, and I do like that movie. I know it was very polarizing when it came out, but I do like that film for what it is, and Anthony Hopkins, of course, reprises the role of Hannibal Lecter in that, and I will say he is a little more cartoonish in that one. And then in 2002, we got another adaptation of Red Dragon. This one made specifically to tie in more with the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal films, making it simultaneously a remake of Manhunter and a prequel to The Silence of the Lambs. The 2002 movie was directed by Brett Ratner and written by Ted Talley, who actually wrote the screenplay for Silence of the Lambs. And I will say this, the 2002 movie is extremely faithful to the book. There are some lines of dialogue and scenes that are almost word for word from the novel, so if you are a huge fan of the original Red Dragon novel, I will say it's technically a better adaptation than Manhunter. That being said, as a film, I think Manhunter is a vastly superior film. Yeah, I am not a fan of the 2002 Red Dragon movie. I find it to be a painfully bland and mediocre film. I'll give it this, it is well made. It's probably Brett Ratner's best movie, to be honest, but that's also not saying much because, frankly, I think the guy is kind of a hack, and I don't feel bad saying that because, from what I understand, he's also a massive prick in real life. And look, it is very true to the book, and Red Dragon was a good book, but being more faithful to the source material doesn't automatically make something a better movie, and to me, because the movie was almost slavishly devoted to the book, it kind of accentuated the aspects of the novel that were a little silly. The movie starred Edward Norton as Will Graham, and look, Edward Norton is a great actor in movies like Primal Fear, Fight Club, American History X, but I'll be honest, I am not a fan of his as Will Graham. I find it to be a very bland, very mediocre performance. Like, I don't buy for a second that this guy is as mentally tortured as Graham is supposed to be in the book, and I think William Peterson actually captured that really well, whereas I don't get that same sense from Ed Norton's Will Graham. You also had Harvey Keitel as Jack Crawford, and Keitel is an amazing actor, and he's actually not a bad choice for Crawford, but again, I prefer Dennis Farina. I even prefer Scott Glenn's portrayal of Crawford compared to Keitel's portrayal of this character. And then you had Ralph Fiennes as Francis Dollarhide, and it is a very good performance. Ralph Fiennes is a great actor, and it is very faithful to the book. But again, I prefer Tom Noonan in this role. The same thing with Philip Seymour Hoffman as Freddie Lowndes. It's a great performance, but I prefer Stephen Lang in this role. The same thing with Emily Watson as Reba. It's a great performance. It's actually probably one of the best performances in the film. I just prefer Joan Allen as this character. And in a lot of ways, I know I'm being unfair. Like, a lot of my review of the movie Red Dragon is kinda just unfair comparisons to Manhunter. But again, I just think Manhunter did the story a lot better. You also had Mary Louise Parker as Will's wife, Molly, who I will say technically does have a bit more to do in this than she did in Manhunter, so I guess that is one point I will give to Red Dragon over Manhunter. And of course you had Anthony Hopkins once again as Hannibal Lecter, and you can tell he's having a lot of fun with the role, but the movie does add a lot more scenes with Dr. Lecter, and again, this is very much the cartoonish Dr. Lecter that we got in Hannibal, rather than the Lecter that we saw in Silence of the Lambs, or even Brian Cox's Lecter from Manhunter. And it just feels very forced. Like, you can tell that the movie is almost desperately trying to recapture the magic of Silence of the Lambs. The movie does add an open-end prologue that explains how Will captured Hannibal Lecter, and to me it was completely unneeded and not for nothing, and I know this was pointed out in a podcast I listened to called The Projection Booth, but I'm gonna repeat what they said because they were absolutely right. I do not buy for a second that somebody as cultured and refined as Dr. Lecter would have a goddamn ponytail. And then the movie added a little epilogue that leads directly into Silence of the Lambs. Again, the movie almost feels slavishly devoted to Silence of the Lambs, even though this is taking place before the events of that movie. That scene was particularly silly because it implied that the events of Silence of the Lambs were happening the day after. And ultimately, I just don't think the movie was necessary. I really don't. As far as I'm concerned, we already had Manhunter. I was perfectly willing to accept Manhunter as the first film in this franchise. Yes, I know, Silence of the Lambs, the movie, was not necessarily made to be a straight sequel to Manhunter, but regardless, I was still willing to accept that as part of the same world, even though there are some continuity errors you have to kind of wrap your brain around. Ultimately, I just think the 2002 Red Dragon was an unneeded, unnecessary film. But yeah, I'm not crazy about it, but I know there are people who do really like the 2002 movie. Now, like I said, Thomas Harris wrote the prequel novel Hannibal Rising in 2006, and that was adapted into the 2007 film of the same name. Now, I've never read the book Hannibal Rising, but I actually do like the movie, and I know I'm in a very, very small minority when it comes to that. And then we got the Hannibal TV series, but before I talk about that, I want to cut to my friend Mark Allan Gunnells again, giving his thoughts on the 2002 Red Dragon.
The film was made again as Red Dragon in 2002, directed by Brett Ratner, and actually written by the same screenwriter who wrote Silence of the Lambs. That one is very faithful to the book and has a stellar all-star cast, and I didn't much like that one either. That one felt a little too by the book. Too much of a cash grab. Silence of the Lambs had been a big hit, then they did Hannibal, which was a big hit, and I think they wanted to capitalize on that by using Anthony Hopkins again in this, what became a prequel to those movies. And it felt like it had no life in it. It felt like it existed only to make money. So those are my thoughts on the Red Dragon novel and the 2 film adaptations, and thank you for listening.
And between 2013 and 2015, we had the NBC series Hannibal, created by Bryan Fuller. Now, the show was not in continuity with either the books or the movies, nor was it a straight adaptation of any one of the books, with the exception of Red Dragon, which got adapted in the 3rd season. Rather, what the show was, it was sort of a reimagining of the entire Thomas Harris Hannibal Lecter universe. Like, the show ostensibly begins as sort of a prequel to Red Dragon, where it's sort of leading up to those events, only it's set in modern time, whereas the original novel was set in the 80s. And you had the characters doing radically different things than they did in the books, or you had them have certain relationships that they didn't have in the books. The show would also gender swap certain characters, like Freddie Lounds is in the show, but is a woman on the show, and you also had the character of Alana Bloom, who is sort of loosely based on the character of Alan Bloom from the novel Red Dragon, who does appear in Manhunter. However, in Manhunter, he's called Sidney Bloom. Like, the way I look at the show is, I look at it as being almost in, like, the alternate timeline of the Hannibal Lecter universe. But I like the show quite a bit. It wasn't perfect, especially in the 1st season. It was sort of serial killer of the week, where each episode would be about Will Graham and Jack Crawford trying to track down a different serial killer, and you had Hannibal Lecter sort of helping them with the investigations, and this is before they find out that Lecter is a serial killer himself. And some of the murders they would investigate would almost be a little too elaborate, and I will say the show got kind of preposterous later on with some of the twists and turns they would take. In the show, you had Hugh Dancy as Will Graham, who I thought did a great job. I didn't like him quite as much as William Peterson in this role, but he still did a damn good job in the show, and the show really did play up how tortured Graham is. You also had Lawrence Fishburne as Jack Crawford, and then you had Mads Mikkelsen as Hannibal Lecter. Now, while I think Brian Cox is technically the best of all the Hannibal Lecters, I think Mads Mikkelsen at least stands toe-to-toe with Anthony Hopkins. First of all, Mads Mikkelsen is an amazing actor, and he really did play up how cultured and sophisticated Hannibal Lecter is. And maybe this is owed to Mads Mikkelsen's charisma, or maybe this just says a lot about me, but he's also kinda likable as Hannibal, even when he's committing these horrific crimes. And his voice is just so goddamn soothing, like I want this man to read me a bedtime story. But honestly, the best thing about the show is really the whole dynamic between Graham and Dr. Lecter. Like, throughout the show, they develop a very complex and complicated relationship where even when Graham realizes that Lecter is a serial killer, there's still a weird respect and possibly even love that they have for each other. And the show definitely plays up this idea that Hannibal might actually love Will. And in the show, we finally get to see Garrett Jacob Hobbs, a character who is mentioned in the books but never actually makes an appearance. In the show, he's essentially the main antagonist of the first episode. And Hobbs' daughter, Abigail, who is hinted at in Red Dragon, she becomes a major character on the show, and after Garrett Jacob Hobbs is killed, Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter kinda become surrogate father figures to Abigail, and Lecter is trying to create sort of a fucked up family dynamic between him, Will, and Abigail. I thought all of that stuff was done brilliantly on the show, and it was some of the best parts of the show, to be honest. And the show also had a lot of these weird hallucinatory sequences, honestly kind of like Manhunter when we're getting inside Will's mind or Hannibal's mind or the minds of any of the other serial killers on the show. And while that was really cool, there were times where I think they kind of overdid it. The show also did have kind of a weird supernatural undercurrent where Will would hallucinate Hannibal as a Wendigo, and I think Brian Fuller and Mads Mikkelsen both said that they essentially wanted to portray Lecter as essentially the devil. And the second half of season 3 adapts Red Dragon as a multi-episode story arc. And I'll be completely honest, I'm not crazy about how the show handled the Red Dragon storyline. I thought Richard Armitage, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, did a fine job as Francis Dollarhide. I just wasn't crazy about how the show handled his story, and I felt no real emotion towards it. And all the actors did fine jobs in their roles. I don't know, there's just something about the way they did it that just did not appeal to me, and it honestly felt kind of rushed, which is weird because they had multiple episodes to tell this story. I don't know, it's almost like they were trying too hard, and there's just something about the Red Dragon storyline of the show that just left me feeling kinda cold, and not in a good way. And in a way, it is what the show was building up to. Like, you knew they were eventually going to adapt Red Dragon. I don't know, I just don't think it worked overall. Obviously, they had to reinterpret some of the story to have it fit in with the continuity of the show, and they also had to modernize certain things since the original novel came out in the 80s, but it just didn't work for me. It's a good show overall, I just wasn't crazy about the Red Dragon story arc. Now, from what I understand, Brian Fuller's original plan was to also adapt the events of Silence of the Lambs after he wrapped up the Red Dragon storyline on the show, and he wanted to eventually bring Clarice Starling and Buffalo Bill into the show's universe, but they knew they were getting cancelled after the 3rd season, and I think for copyright reasons, they couldn't actually use the character of Clarice Starling, which is a shame because I would have loved to have seen how the show would have handled the character of Clarice. Now, there was actually a Clarice TV series, but that was completely unconnected to the Hannibal series. Now, both Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, as well as their subsequent movie adaptations, have had a huge impact on popular culture. They had a huge influence on the crime genre, on the horror genre, on later police procedural shows and movies, as well as other serial killer dramas. I already mentioned the influence that Manhunter had, and the influence that Silence of the Lambs had is freaking astronomical. I really do think stuff like David Fincher's Seven and shows like True Detective and even the Saw movies and films like Longlegs all owe something to the Thomas Harris novels. You also had the Batman comic, The Long Halloween, by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, which you could tell was heavily inspired by both Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs. Basically, in that story, Batman is tracking a serial killer who kills people around holidays, and he gets help from another serial killer who is now locked away in Arkham Asylum called the Calendar Man, and you can tell that the Calendar Man in that story was meant to be a stand-in for Hannibal Lecter, with Batman as sort of a stand-in for Will Graham or Clarice Starling. And speaking of Batman, you had the Matt Reeves, Robert Pattinson Batman film from a few years ago, which was heavily inspired by Long Halloween. Basically, that movie reimagines the Riddler as a serial killer, but the Joker is also in that movie, but he doesn't show up till the end. But from what I understand, originally he had a lot more scenes, and there were scenes of Batman going to visit the Joker at Arkham Asylum, and the Joker was going to sort of allow Batman to get into the mindset of a killer and was going to sort of give him clues on how to catch the Riddler. Like, basically, the Joker was going to have sort of the Hannibal Lecter role. So yeah, that was my review of Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, and bye.